Lesson 31. How does Jesus feel about prodigals? Those wandering, those wayward. Maybe we're talking about you. There is a parable in Luke 15. There's actually a string of parables that comes out of this conversation in verse 1 and 2. It says that Jesus was hanging around with tax collectors and sinners, and the Pharisees begin to object. Birds of a feather flock together. Why are you with those people? See, this goes back to a previous lesson. They believed that sinfulness or uncleanness was more contagious than cleanness. And Jesus felt the opposite. Now, if they're right, you shouldn't hang around sinners because they'll make you dirty. But if Jesus is right, you have to hang around sinners because your cleanness can rub off on them and vastly improve their lives. So Jesus tells a series of parables, not one, but 3 in chapter 15, about a lost sheep, a lost coin, and a lost son. The lost sheep, every guy could relate to because all of them had run into the fields looking for a lost sheep for themselves or a friend. The lost coin, every woman could relate to because they would be in their houses. This kind of a domestic kind of a story, and in those days that's where women were, so they could relate. But the last story about a father and 2 sons, everyone could relate to because we all have family trauma. We all have people in our families that make life better, but sometimes also more difficult. So those are the 3 parables. But here's what's really interesting. If you remove the chapter division and go from 15 to 16, you find 2 more parables that are also about lost and found. Chapter 16, verses 1 through 13, tells a story about a dishonest manager who used his current resources for a future place so that he could have security after he lost his job. Well, it's a story about money, but it's really about heaven and hell. And then a few verses later, beginning in verse 19, you hear this famous story about Dives and Lazarus. Now, Dives isn't named in the biblical text, but in church history, he's called Dives, and Lazarus was the poor man at his gate. They both died, and they switched places in the afterlife, so that Lazarus was comforted in Abraham's bosom, and Dives was suffering in Hades, or what we would call hell. Now, what I'm discerning, and really connecting this to our previous lesson about money, is that how you love people, the least and the lost, will be revealed by how you use your resources, either to help find them or to ignore them. So the parable about a dishonest manager is how to use your money to get to heaven, and the parable about Dives and Lazarus is how to use your money to get to hell. So that's one revelation about whether you care the same way Jesus cares about lost people. But here's another revelation, and this was really stunning to me. Jesus portrayed God the Father in the famous parable of the prodigal son. He portrayed God as somewhat foolish. Well, not even somewhat foolish. He was foolish. In the Middle East, if a younger son asked for the inheritance early, he's saying to his father, I hate you, I hate Kansas, give me my money, I'm out of here. Kenneth Bailey was a missionary in the Middle East for over 30 years, also a biblical scholar. And everywhere he went, he would ask people what would happen if a son asked for his father's inheritance early. They said, well, that wouldn't happen. That would never happen. There's no way that would happen. But then he said, okay, what if it did? Well, the father would beat him. But the father in the story doesn't beat the son. He actually capitulates to a foolish request, knowing that a foolish son with a foolish request with a lot of money is going to be poor very soon. And then when the son comes home, the father ran to him. Men in the Middle East, they don't run. That's beneath their dignity. The higher you go, the more you slow roll it down the street. Jesus portrayed God as a foolish father, vulnerable to the love of his son. And at the end of the story, this really comes out of a book that I read called Return of the Prodigal Son. It's not about the parable as much as the painting by Rembrandt. And the author is describing this painting of Rembrandt, how the father is painted as Rembrandt was in his later life, blind. And how the father is really the center of the story. And often we read the story and ask, which son are you? Are you the younger son that has rebelled, or are you the older son that has problems with rebellious people coming into church? That's the wrong interpretation of this story. And Henry Nouwen, the author of this book, says the real point of the story is not, are you the younger son or are you the older son? Are you the father? And if we are to seek and save the lost, like Jesus, it's not going to be by avoiding being the younger son. It's not going to be by avoiding being the older brother. It's going to be by attempting to be the father. And that will require us to act in ways that seem foolish or irresponsible to the world. Are you willing to have people accuse you of being crazy, irresponsible, unhinged? Are you willing to use your resources to seek and save the lost? Because that's the only way to become like the Father, and the only way to share the heart of Jesus for the lost that are found.